Welcome to Community Forum. My name is John Gogliettino, and I'm your host. We're going to have a change of gears. We're going back to travels. I travel a lot, and I have a good friend of mine, a good friend of the show, who's been on here a couple of times, also in his capacity as a past fire chief of the city of Danbury. That could be a show on itself. We'll get into all of the things that he's not supposed to talk about now that he's been out for a while. So it's Geoff Herald's with us, and we're going to be talking about his travels in Europe. And I want to welcome you again to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be back.
You're welcome. And let's start. How did this trip originate? For those, we'll talk a little bit about that because there's new people watching this time around that weren't watching. We talked about it a little bit at another show.
Oh, absolutely. My parents were both members of the Greatest Generation, and they both read avidly, particularly history, and I kind of picked up the habit. So I became very interested in the wars, World War I and World War II. And my mom and dad both joined the Navy right after the start of World War II in 1942. And as a result, they had a lot of history with it. And, there was a lot of talk about it growing up. So I always had a bit of an interest in it. And
so you decided to go back and explore.
I decided back 15 years ago, actually, or more, I started thinking about taking a trip in Europe specifically to see the World War II battlefields. And then I'd gotten into some of the World War I history as well, considering it was the 100th anniversary of the start of World War I, a couple of years ago, and we're getting up to the end of World War I in another 2 years, another 100th anniversary of that. So it's been very interesting. It was in the interest of myself and my parents, my family. So I kind of decided to take a look at this trip, and I started researching the trips, and I found several different itineraries, tour groups that do different various perspectives. And I found one that actually had a great tour, 2 weeks, that did both World War I and World War II European battlefields. And it started in London, progressed into France and Paris, and wound up in Belgium, Holland, and eventually ended up in Amsterdam. It was a great trip, covered a lot of ground.
Okay, so let's do some kind of a logical survey as to where did you start again?
Well, I flew out of Kennedy Airport and flew into London. Now, London, of course, was the epicenter of the resistance against Hitler in World War II, if you will. Hitler conquered most of Europe, of course, in the progress of the early on stages of World War II. And so World War II, first battlefield that we visited was really London, the Battle of London, and the perspectives of that. We went to the Battle of London Museum, the group we were with, and they went to the Imperial War Museum and did some things in London itself. And then from there, we progressed south of London and down into Portsmouth, into the naval base area in Portsmouth. And Portsmouth Naval Base is the largest naval base in Europe, and has served as the primary naval base for the British Navy, of course, for the last 700 years. And it's a huge, huge enclave there with lots of military history. Matter of fact, while there, we got to visit a couple of significant ships from the British Navy. The Warrior, which was the British Navy's first ironclad ship, is on display there, but also Admiral Nelson's Victory is on display there. So they were two major things we got to see. And of course, the Victory and the Warrior go back far beyond World War I and World War II.
Oh, yeah.
So that was all part of the history. But there's also an active naval base there, a great museum. But the high point of being in Portsmouth was we all got onto our modes of transport, various modes of transport. In this particular case, we went into a motor coach and onto a ferry. And the ferry left from Portsmouth and actually wound over to Normandy, basically taking the same route of the D-Day invasion, because Portsmouth was a major embarkation point for the invasion of Normandy at that time. And we ended up landing over there on a village in Normandy between two of the invasion beaches.
How long did it take from going from the port to what was it, a matter like half an hour?
Oh, no, it was about 6 hours.
It does take a while. Okay.
It took a while, and actually the original invasion forces, depending on the individual ships, took anywhere from 3 to 4 hours to 6 or 8 hours, depending on the speed of the ships. The LSTs and the landing ships, of course, at that time.
So what
were
you're
much
saying,
slower.
it's like 100 miles or more.
Well, yeah, and I honestly don't remember the mileage, but it took about 6 hours to get there. And it was really kind of interesting to be on the same invasion route from the same point to the same point of that invasion in World War II. And as you come up to Normandy, you see the long, low-slung coastline, which was so common, and you see it in all the pictures, the photographs, the movies based on World War II, on the invasion of Normandy. Once we landed there, we visited the beaches. Sword, Juno, Gold, and Omaha beaches, of course. Pointe du Hoc, where the Rangers made the assault up the cliff face against the German, embedded troops there. And Omaha Beach, when you stand on the bluff, you look out, and when the tide is out, it's just this huge expanse of territory that the soldiers and landing craft had to land and put their soldiers on. You can see why they were exposed to enemy fire for so long, and the bravery of the men involved there, and as they came ashore, is just incredible just to see. And
did they tell you how many men went over? I used to know how many.
I don't remember the exact numbers on each beach, certainly at all. The number of divisions that landed during the first 12-hour period, of course. And then they call it the longest day for so many different reasons. It was
so many people died.
Many people were injured and died. But the reality of it was the longest day because historically it had so much riding on it. For the Germans, it was the only way to prevent the invasion and therefore their eventual downfall was to stop us on the beaches. And for us, the opposite was true. If we were going to be successful, the Allies were going to be successful in defeating the Germans. That day, the hours, the hours stretched to days, and it had to have a beachhead and a place to put the troops ashore. Once on shore there, and when we visited the actual landing, we went to several different museums in the area. And we got to see the actual, the ruins of the mulberries, which were the artificial harbors they put in that were there, and the bridges that were there, and Arromanches, and the different museums.
They still have those harbors.
There's still lots there. On the ground, there's museums all over. There's tanks, there's landing craft, there's the bridging devices and all. They're all still available for actually to go up and touch. There's the landing craft. You can still see them, and the ruins are actually out in the shore. You can see the ruined harbors and they left them there both as a memorial to the men and women who put them together in England, shipped them across and built the harbors and such. And that harbor was the primary way of bringing troops and material in for the next several months because they never caught a workable, manageable, large port that could handle it.
So when you came over, I want to make this point because I missed it at first. It was ferries that brought you over, and you had motor coaches that originated.
I was on a motor coach tour, but you could do it on foot. You could do it on your own car. You could do it on organized tours in other ways. Yeah, some of the tours actually use the channel, come across that way on the vehicles and such. Yeah, this particular one, that was an option that one of the itineraries I chose not to do. I like the idea of coming across on the ferry and actually coming into Normandy, and because of a historical perspective once again.
Right.
And once we were in Normandy, of course, you're in an area that is so steeped in history. And one of the first cities we saw beyond the battlefield areas, we went to Bayeux, where the Bayeux Tapestry is. And the Bayeux Tapestry is on display, and they have a wonderful display there. And of course, that refers to William the Conqueror leaving the Normandy and invading England in 1066, which changed the course of English history.
Which he was a cousin. He was related to somebody over there that they asked him to come.
Harold and he were, directly related. But in the end, of course, his army defeated Harold's army. Harold was shot through the eye with an arrow, and William the Conqueror took over.
Any relationship?
Actually, no. But interestingly, the spelling of Harold there in ancient times.
But that's
actually
H-A.
Yeah, H-A. But that actually is the first name. But that actually refers to, it's assumed to be a clan chieftain. And so Harold also meant more than just the name in that case. But anyway, William the Conqueror beat Harold and, took over England and changed the course of that, obviously building the Anglo-Saxons that, my history certainly comes from.
Right.
And so as we progressed through the battlefields there, we went through the
What was the first
French
battlefield
area.
that you went to?
Well, the first battlefield was the Battle of London. And then the next battlefield was Normandy, and then the Bocage in the area immediately outside of the Normandy invasion, where they were bottled up for 4 to 6 weeks, depending on where on the battlefield they broke out. And then,
then the next one is what I meant to say.
Well, the next one beyond that, after we went up and through the Bocage area, we went in through where eventually the British broke out in the Falaise Gap, and then went into Paris eventually. So the next battlefield essentially was the whole of France between Normandy and the Paris region. And we went on into Paris and spent a couple of days there. We got to do some of the historical perspectives of Paris. I'd never been to Paris before. So I did do a few of the things that you typically would do. You went to the Arc, you went to the
tour of the
Tower, tour of the city, and we had a few days there where we were doing motor coach tours out to other battlefields, as well as spending time in Paris, and got to experience some of Paris. Going out to dinner.
You didn't go to Versailles.
Nightlife. We didn't. It was a side trip. trip. No, there was a side trip to Versailles. I chose not to do it.
Because it's long.
Instead, no, yeah, it was a 6-hour trip, but Versailles and World War I and the historical aspect of that was obviously very significant. But I opted at that time to spend some time in France and Paris itself, and explored Paris and did the underground and went up to Montmartre and see the view of Paris that made so famous by so many painters and looking down on Paris. But from Paris, over the next couple of days, we did do some tours, like going out from the wheels of a spoke, and then we eventually moved north and went to Rennes, and we saw the another significantly different historical period. We went into the Champagne region. And while we were there,
did you taste some of the?
Oh yeah, we went to the Taittinger Champagne House.
Yeah,
and it was one of the places I'm fond of champagne. So we went there and we went into the chalk caves where they aged their champagne. What's very interesting about that, the initial caves were carved 2,000 years ago by the Roman legions who took over the area. And there's actually some areas of these caves where they have some Roman drawings, Roman drawings and basically graffiti on the cave walls, where, in whatever form it takes, it's probably Latin for Kilroy was here. But they did have some drawings and some, scratches and pictures drawn into the caves. But they used the champagne, and they still use these caves now to store and age their champagne. And during World War II, they were blocked up and they protected some of their champagne. So the Germans, when they came in to try to get it, which they got some, but they didn't get the best. Because the French were very quick, very protective of that, and they were actually able to protect it.
That's interesting.
And beyond there, we went hitting the World War I battlefields. The front for World War I was just a few miles north of Paris.
Yeah, there was like an arc.
And it actually went for 600 miles from the North Sea and the English Channel all the way down to the Swiss border. And the trench lines are still there in many places throughout. You can stand up on a hill and you can see the old markings from where the trench lines were. You can see them all over. But the battlefields themselves for World War I, we went to visit several of them. Vimy Ridge, where the Canadians made such a heroic attack, and that was the first significant battle for the Canadians in World War I, where they were under their own command and their command structure. And it was a very vicious battle. We went to Passchendaele. We went to the Somme. We went to the Marne. And these memorials are all there from World War I that were put up, in the 20s and 30s prior to World War II. But these memorials are massive, and the cemeteries are scattered throughout the area, northern France into Belgium and Holland, and very moving areas. You'll see cemeteries both, allies, meaning all of the allied nations have some separate, the American cemetery, or you'll be,
and there was
French
very
and
little
cemeteries.
movement,
Oh yeah, the trench lines were just a horrible war of attrition, and fight for weeks and to gain no yardage, and just a massive killing environment. We did go to one of the significant American battles there, where the Marines were blooded and became known as a world-class fighting force, and that was Chateau Thierry. And to be there to see where they fought and to see where they actually were.
They have a song on that. That's based on that.
Yeah, there's lots of history around here, but this particular hill in the battlefield where the Marines made their name for themselves is well kept. It's a beautiful memorial, and the cemetery itself is in an arc around the base of the hill, which was at the center of the battlefield at the time. And of course, as you're at the battlefield, you see the pictures before and after the battle and during the battle. And when you're there now, of course, it's a lot of woodlands and wooded areas, but at the end of the war, there were no trees standing. It was bare countryside. They're still finding, by the way, they still find bodies and munitions from World War I, far more so than even from World War II in this area.
Yeah, there was that many people.
And they find there's huge areas, huge swaths that are cordoned off with warnings to not
live
cross
ammo.
Live ammunition still there. And every year, the number that they showed us was 26 people are killed on average every year in this area by picking up and playing with live ammunition from World War I. Now the problem is, these are hidden underground because the ground was so chewed up by artillery fire and such. You don't know where they are. And there's a memorial to the men at one of the craters where the British tunnelers had gone underneath the German lines. laid in a massive mine. Lochnagar, I think, is the name of the mine, the name of the crater. And they blew up the crater and has a way of trying to penetrate the German lines. This particular battle was eventually unsuccessful, but a massive explosion, and they think it killed over 6,000 people in the explosion itself. Just
wow.
Tremendous.
6,000 people on one explosion.
But what's very interesting is that in 1998, there's a memorial there. In 1998, they found a body right on the edge of the rim of the crater, where the ground had eroded away, and they found the skeletal remains. And in this particular case, they were able to identify the soldier. It was a British soldier, and they were able to identify him as having fallen on that day in the invasion.
One of the combatants.
So
yeah.
One of the combatants there, and so that type of history is just overwhelming. When you stand there and you read the history. And I had read much of the history because going into the onset of the 100th anniversary of the start of the war, there was a slew of books that came out, and they covered all kinds of interesting details that had never been available before. As a matter of fact, since the end of World War II, when the Iron Curtain fell, a lot of the information that authors would later use to do discussions and write books about the history of war had been trapped behind the Iron Curtain. So after the fall of the Iron Curtain in 1989, when the wall fell, a lot of this information in the archives again became available. And of course, coming up to that onset of 2014, the 100th anniversary, many authors are writing books. There's several great books, and I read as many of them as I could going into the trip to get a fuller understanding of the war and what it was like.
Yeah, and how it started. People forget how it started.
Oh, yeah, and of course, when you stop and take a look at it, and there was so much intrigue and subterfuge going on between the various factions, the Germans, the Austro-Hungarians, the Russians, the Poles, the Slovaks. Everybody was lying to each other about what they were going to do or what they weren't going to do. The French and the English got involved.
It was almost like they were looking for an excuse to have a war. Well, somebody shot somebody, and Archduke
historians, historians say it was in some ways inevitable that there was going to be another armed conflict. But remember, this was not the first conflict by any stretch between the major combatants here. The history of Europe at this point had been rife with them, and there was a lot of animosity, specifically between the French and the Germans, going back to the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, that took off some territory, and the French wanted it back, and the Germans wanted to keep it. And there's so much intrigue going on there as they work through that. But the thing is that the battlefields are well preserved in many ways, and there's a lot of history there. But it's both a sad environment to see and think about what humans did to humans during this conflict. It was just such an atrocious time. And we moved
and you moved to the World War II.
Well, actually, yeah. And then once we left the Marne and the Somme from World War I, we moved on up into Belgium and Holland, and we visited Arnhem, the scene of the World War II Bridge Too Far battle, which was the Montgomery's Market Garden attack, where he tried several aerial paratrooper assaults with the idea of penetrating deep behind the German lines. And unfortunately, due to faulty intelligence and really overstretching our allies' capabilities of supply, unfortunately, some of the British paratroopers at the Arnhem area in the Bridge Too Far, and it was called the Bridge Too Far because we simply couldn't resupply and get there on time. Most of them were killed or captured and served the remainder of that war from that time, October, into the victory in May of 8 months later. They served time in the prison camps because they were captured, and the bridge was truly a bridge too far. Turned out that the area where they thought they were going to be, where there were going to be very little resistance, turned out to be full of a couple of re-equipping crack Nazi divisions, and the Nazis were actually on guard, and once we landed, it took them only a very short time to get their act together and come back. But the museums there were also very amazing throughout the area. The American paratroopers and the British paratroopers and the fight that they did.
Did you get over to where the Battle of the Bulge was fought?
No, actually, the Battle of the Bulge was not part of this itinerary. We actually kind of circled around it on our trip here to get into that in the Ardennes and all. And by the way, that area of the battle was, the Ardennes battle was a battlefield both in 1940 when the Germans came through in France. In World War I, the Germans came through there on their invasion through the lowlands.
It was an invasion route.
And it was an invasion route. And each time the Allied commanders would say, well, it's too tough and too hard for the Germans to get through. And each time they did. It's really kind of ironic that in 1940 they came through and captured France in really just 5 or 6 weeks. And then in 1944, they mounted a huge attack through there again with their German armor. But in this case, that attack for the Germans was that they ran out of supply and they didn't have the fuel and they didn't capture the amount of fuel they'd hoped to capture. And their goal, of course, was to get all the way back to the English Channel and to separate the Allied forces. And it did eventually fail. And so once we left that area, circled around the Bastogne, around the Ardennes battlefield, we ended up going into Amsterdam. And we finished our tour in Amsterdam, which of course, was captured by the Germans in World War II. But one of the things that was there that was most moving throughout the whole trip was the Anne Frank Museum. Now, Anne Frank, of course, was a Jewish family who was in hiding for so long, and then they were captured in the fall of 1944. And eventually she and her family, all but her father, were executed in the German concentration camps. And her diary survived. And her diary told the story of the family in such a moving way. And I was kind of anxious about going to this museum because it had the potential to be overwrought, if you will. But when you got there, and I strongly, I urge anybody that's got an interest in history to do one of these tours. But when you get to Amsterdam and the museums that are there, there's several great places to go visit. But the Anne Frank Museum is not at all what I was afraid it was going to be. It was a moving, emotional, and very well maintained and well presented museum. It was just incredible.
Is that where they lived?
That's actually the house where they lived in. It was a house hidden behind another house on the front street there. And they were eventually betrayed. Somebody basically told the Gestapo or whoever else, the local police, the gendarme, and they came and they did capture them in the fall of 1944 and bring them off to a concentration camp. But the museum itself is terribly moving. It's barely furnished, but it's in such a way as to really drive home that sense of fear and despair in such a way that it moves you to really understand what they went through in a way that I was very pleased because I hadn't anticipated that.
Now, how many people were on your tour, your particular
Oh, that's
group?
interesting. That's a great question. It turned out to be there were 47 of us on a regular full-size motor coach. It was run by Trafalgar Tours. And as I said, there are several different groups that provide these tours. Actually, I'm looking at another one now that does I believe it's called the 10 Most Important European Battlefields. And what's really interesting about that, and I don't think that's a Trafalgar tour, but it's another tour that goes to the battlefields that cover most of Europeans' major history. And it doesn't just deal with World War I and World War II. It involves the Napoleonic Wars, so it goes to Waterloo. It involves the internecine warfare between other European countries. I believe it covers Hastings, Normandy, Waterloo, Austerlitz, Crécy, the other battles between France and England for those 700 years that they were always at war with somebody.
Right.
And then covers up...
They seem to be always at war.
Absolutely. And then it goes on into Poland and Austria with a couple of their battles. So it's really interesting. And I'm looking at that, right now. My next trip is not going to be a battlefield tour. I've actually just booked a trip on a river cruise in Europe. That's a 2-week river cruise that goes from Amsterdam.
Many people go on that river cruise.
And it's another hugely historical because the canals in Europe are how the Europeans traded. And they built these canals over 1,000 years. And so we're going in from a trip on a boat that leaves Amsterdam and goes in through the Rhine River eventually, through the canal system to the Rhine, and then to other rivers and other canals. And eventually, 2 weeks later, winds up in Budapest.
I was going to say that's the one I heard about.
Yeah,
right?
And it's looking to be a great itinerary, and you'll see the European cities from the river, and it's a different perspective, but it's the way historically many people got around. So once again, it's got that historical perspective for me. I've got a couple other trips in mind too. I'm looking to do there. I'm going to do the Baltic. I'm going to do a North Atlantic cruise from England to the United States because I want to do that. So I've got some other trips in mind. And
they keep you talking. Are you going to do some kind of a memoir on this thing?
Oh, I don't know if I'll do a memoir. I take a lot of pictures. Actually, in my European trip, the World War II the battlefield tour, I took 990 photographs. And so I've got
900.
quite a collection, 990 pictures. And
yeah, you could do a memoir.
I had to throw a few of them out. They were out of focus or something. But generally, I have over 900 photographs. And it's an amazing itinerary to see.
Yeah.
And what I would strongly urge anybody with an interest in history, it's well done. You can do them on your own. You can do your own tour guide, set up your own bed and breakfast stays or whatever. But this first one, I really wanted to do it with a...
We're not supposed to get into pricing, but what range do these things run?
They go. The range is tremendous. If
you were doing like a basic.
Well, I figure you probably figure on $250 to $300 a day, all things included, except airfare. Airfare can vary. Right now,
yeah, that's what I wanted.
With the strong dollar right now, actually, it's become less expensive. With the strong dollar. So right now is a good time to consider it. And over the next several months or a year and such, it's probably a good time to consider going into there.
Yeah, it's a good idea. Yeah,
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I was going to say what's your next, but we've already covered that.
I've got a couple other things in mind too.
Yeah. Okay.
One of the things I don't know how much time we have left. I don't know what we're talking.
We've only got a couple of minutes.
Okay.
A minute and a half.
On the tour, the World War I, World War II tour, to really wrap that up a little bit. The thing is about that, to recognize what the generations that were there, what they did to defeat the scourge of Nazi Germany and that horrible fascism he imposed on all of Europe. And my parents were, as I said, both members of the greatest generation. They both served the Navy, for my dad for 20 plus years and my mother for 10. How that whole generation stood up, not just in the United States, but in Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. And that was the other thing. The trip involved people from Canada, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, all allied countries that put up people to fight for them. There were several veterans on the troop. One of the veterans was a World War II veteran who had last been on Omaha Beach on June 8th, 1944, and he drove a tank off the beach, had never been back.
All right, they're telling us we're running out of time. I want to thank you for coming on the show.
John, thank you so very much. Thanks
You're
for
welcome.
being here.
All right.
I appreciate it.
Okay, and I want to thank the viewers for tuning in to Community Forum. Tune in next week, same time, same station, and we'll have another interesting program. Good night for now, and we'll see you then.